this is Sean McCloskey, and we're going to be talking about the console wars of the early 1980s. And we're talking about the consoles, the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and the Colecovision. All three consoles, which I'm very well familiar with. I received the Atari 2600 and Colecovision as a Christmas present for my 5th birthday. We want to compare the console wars of the early 1980s with the console wars that included the Wii, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. I'm going to be referring to the PS3, Wii, Xbox 360 generation as the current generation. We know it's not, but for purposes of this talk, that's what I'm going to refer to it as. I do not see the similarities between the console wars of the 80s and the current generation. There are just too many differences in my opinion. The first and major difference is most major consoles today release about the same time, giving them a chance to equally share in the spotlight of having a new system. Also, newer games that are being developed are developed among multiple platforms, very few exclusive titles. Let's rewind now back to the 1980s. The Atari 2600 was first to market, and it also had a huge selection of games at the time. The Intellivision then comes out, and it has, I wouldn't say improved graphics, but I would say different graphics. So you had the Atari 2600 and you had the Intellivision sitting there battling it out. If you were going to say anything about a console war, that would be the console war, Intellivision Atari, because it wasn't until many years later that Colecovision decides to enter the race. Colecovision actually jump-started the graphics and sound in video games. Here you were able to play almost perfect arcade ports of games in your home living room. The Colecovision also came out with a device that allowed you to play your Atari 2600 games on your Colecovision console. Therefore, I believe that the Colecovision was a better system. Unfortunately, it came at a time in history where the Nintendo Entertainment System was just around the corner. So, unfortunately, the ColecoVision's life was short-lived. We also have to look at the time frame that the original consoles were out in. Video gaming hadn't been something that had been established. It was not a widespread phenomenon. Mostly it was, families buying systems to play games with families. It wasn't an individualized hobby yet. So you didn't really have the same level of commitment that you do to consoles today. Also, due to the timing of the releases, people were more apt to go out and buy a new console because more time had elapsed between the last console purchase and the current console purchase. You didn't have people having to decide between 3 or 4 consoles when they went console shopping. There was only the latest and greatest that was out there. I know in my house we had an Intellivision, ColecoVision, Atari 2600, and a Channel F. So we were pretty much ahead of the curve when it came to video game consoles, but I know most of my friends only had one console, and that was usually the Atari 2600. The current console generation tries to release around the same time because they don't want their competitor to have a bigger market share. Unfortunately, due to the fact that most games now are cross-platformed, that means the only differences between the consoles is a personal preference, and there's really no one reason to buy one console over the other. It's not an actual war, it's more of a war of preference. I don't mean to come off sounding like cross-platforming is a bad thing. In fact, for game developers, cross-platforming maximizes profits, and it is something that was being done during the first generation of consoles. One of the issues that modern gamers complain about is the lack of imagination stemming from companies re-releasing old titles on newer systems. But let's look at an example from the first console generation, and it's one of my favorite games, Ghostbusters. It was released on 10 different consoles, including the Atari 2600, Commodore 64, Sega Genesis, Microsoft MSX, Sega Master System, even the Sinclair ZX81. And we're talking about from a time period from the year 1984 to the year 1990. So we're talking about a release that went through multiple console generations. In conclusion, you can see that the first generation wasn't necessarily a war, as they did not occupy the same retail shelf space during the same time, where nowadays it's a competitive market.